He left her without knowing she carried his child. Years later, he stood at the altar until she arrived with a little girl who looked just like him. In front of everyone, the truth shattered everything and built something even stronger. A story of heartbreak, redemption, and a father's second chance you'll never forget. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that hit straight to the heart. I'm not sure what exactly made me pick up the envelope that night. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the tie I kept tightening and loosening, trying to make myself feel like a man in control. Or maybe it was the reflection in the window of my 32nd floor office. The man staring back didn't look like someone about to marry the daughter of the most powerful man in Charleston. He looked like someone who'd built the wrong life on the right blueprint. My name is Ethan Rowe, architect, CEO, 42 years old and living in a downtown condo that smells like teak wood and lemon oil. The Rowe name gleams on half the buildings in the city's skyline. I've won awards, been featured in national magazines, and in 6 days I'm supposed to marry Celeste McCall, the kind of woman most men only meet at fundraisers, and even then, only briefly. The problem? None of that seems to fill the space in my chest that's been quietly widening for years. I walked over to the envelope again. Heavy cardstock, handwritten address, no stamp, no return address. Just a name, Claire Dawson. I hadn't seen her in 7 years. Not since I stood under the magnolia tree behind her family's farmhouse and told her I was leaving for Dubai. Not since I watched her mouth open, close, then finally press into that familiar line of disbelief she wore when she was trying not to break. Not since I walked away without looking back. It wasn't because she wasn't enough. Claire was the only person who ever made me forget what I was chasing, and that's exactly why I left. Back then, I thought ambition meant cutting all the cords, tying myself only to achievement. I thought if I stayed, I'd become small, ordinary. So I left. And for years, I told myself that was the price of greatness. But now, standing on the rooftop terrace of my own building, watching the sun dip below the old church steeples and cobblestone streets of Charleston, I wasn't so sure anymore. My phone buzzed behind me. A message from Celeste. Final tasting at 6. Chef wants your input on the amuse-bouche. Of course she does. Celeste wants input on everything but feelings. The wedding planner has a spreadsheet for napkin folds, the florist has an NDA, and the cake is apparently an architectural marvel. 9 tiers reinforced with steel rods. I should care. But all I could think about was the porch swing behind Claire's farmhouse and the way she used to close her eyes when I read her blueprints out loud like bedtime stories. The elevator dinged. My sister Rachel stepped out, clipboard in hand, hair pulled into a no-nonsense twist. "You didn't answer, Celeste," she said. "She's waiting." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. She already knew where my head was. Her eyes followed my gaze to the envelope on the credenza. "You're still thinking about sending it?" "I don't know," I said. "I guess. I just want her to know I didn't forget." Rachel crossed her arms and leaned against the glass. "You're marrying someone else, Ethan." "I know? And inviting your ex to watch it happen?" "It's not about that." I could hear my voice softening, like I wasn't talking to her anymore. "It's about not pretending it didn't matter." She stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and set it next to my phone. "Then send it, or don't. But don't use it to punish yourself." When she left, the room fell silent again. Charleston was always beautiful at twilight, but tonight it felt hollow, like a city I'd built with no doors. I sat down at my drafting table. Spread out in front of me were the blueprints for the new waterfront promenade I was designing for the McCall family. It was sleek, modern, flawless, but I hated it. It had no soul. My mind drifted, not to Celeste, not to the reception tent at Middleton Place, but to Claire, to the way she'd rest her forehead against mine when we argued, stubborn and soft all at once, to how she smelled like basil and rainwater, to the night she whispered, "Just don't leave me wondering." And I had. For 7 years. I picked up the envelope. No stamp. Still time to back out, but my thumb pressed the seal anyway. If nothing else, she deserved to know that I remembered, that there had been a version of me who stayed awake at night wondering if she was okay. If she ever forgave me. If she ever told someone my name. Or worse, if she never did. The concierge at my building raised an eyebrow when I handed it over. "No return address?" he asked. "Doesn't need one," I said. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I stood there in the mirror and asked myself a question I hadn't dared ask in years. What if I was wrong? What if success wasn't about skyscrapers and press features? What if it was about a woman in rubber boots and the little girl I hadn't met yet, with green eyes I didn't know I'd passed on? What if the only thing worse than sending that invitation was not knowing what might have happened if I had? So I sent it, not expecting anything, not hoping for forgiveness, just needing, desperately, to know that maybe, just maybe, the door I closed 7 years ago wasn't locked forever. Bookmark. The sun had barely crested over the rooftops when Claire Dawson tugged on her gardening gloves and stepped out into the morning dew. The Harmony Garden stretched before her like a living canvas, green and unruly, full of life and noise and dirt. She loved it that way. The place had been a forgotten city lot once, choked with weeds and broken bottles. Now it was rows of kale, sunflowers, and the occasional crooked tomato vine planted by tiny hands. Kids from the local school came every Tuesday. Retired volunteers came on Thursdays. And Claire? She came every day. She knelt beside the north plot, pressing her fingers deep into the soil, pulling weeds with practiced care. It grounded her. She didn't think about the mortgage or the broken sink or the way the ceiling fan in her bedroom made that ticking sound she never had time to fix. She didn't think about the past either. Not usually. "Miss Claire," a voice called from the raised beds. She looked up. Eli, a 7-year-old with a gap-toothed grin and mismatched boots, was holding up a crooked carrot like it was treasure. "Well, would you look at that?" Claire smiled. "That might be the finest-looking carrot in Charleston." Eli beamed as she helped him rinse it off in the rain barrel, and for a moment it was just another normal morning. Until a smaller voice called from behind her, one that always cut straight to her center. "Mama?" Claire turned, already smiling. A little girl was running toward her, curls bouncing like springs, a folded envelope flapping in her hand like a captured bird. Her name was Lily, 6 years old, bright-eyed, and the absolute axis around which Claire's world spun. A sixth thing magical. "This was in the mailbox," Lily said breathlessly, thrusting the envelope toward her mother like it was something magical. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans and knelt to Lily's height, heart already tightening with that strange maternal radar that told her something was off. She took the envelope, felt the weight of the paper. No return address. But her name, Claire Dawson, was written in handwriting she hadn't seen in almost a decade. It stopped her breath. She turned it over slowly. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was an ivory invitation, thick and expensive, the kind of thing printed on specialty cardstock that smelled faintly of cedar and ambition. "Ethan Rowe and Celeste McCall invite you to celebrate their union." The rest of the words blurred. Lily was still looking up at her, eyes wide, sensing the change in the air the way kids always do. "Are you sad?" she asked. Claire didn't answer right away. She folded the invitation with care, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "It's just an old friend," she said gently. Lily tilted her head. "Is he the friend you used to talk about when I asked where my daddy was?" The question struck like a bell in a quiet church. Claire looked at her daughter. Really looked. At her olive skin and sea-glass eyes, the way she crossed her arms when she was nervous, just like Ethan used to. She had asked 1,000 times, in 100 small ways, about the man Claire had never quite been able to explain. "I think maybe he was," Claire said softly. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with her arms wrapped around her favorite stuffed dolphin, Claire sat on the porch, invitation in her lap. The garden lights flickered like tired stars. Her mother, Margaret, stepped through the screen door holding 2 mugs of tea, settling into the chair beside her without a word. "I saw the mail," Margaret said. Claire gave a small nod. You going? You going?" "I don't know." Margaret sipped her tea. "You don't owe him anything." "I know. I know. But sometimes," Margaret began, slow and careful, "sometimes the heart needs to see things through, even when the mind says don't." Claire looked out into the dark garden. She had built everything from scratch: her home, her daughter's world, her own peace. She wasn't sure there was room for Ethan in any of it, and yet, bookmark. "What if it's a mistake?" she whispered. Margaret smiled softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Then let it be the last one." Claire didn't speak for a long while. She stared at the envelope, at her own name scrawled in ink by a man who'd once sworn he'd never forget her. A man who left her wondering. Finally, almost too quiet to hear, she said, "I think I need to see him." And even as her mother nodded, as the cicadas resumed their nightly chorus, Claire felt the familiar weight pressing against her chest, the one that came from hope. Dangerous, wild hope. The kind that whispered, "What if this isn't the end of the story? What if it's the part where something finally begins again?" She glanced through the window into Lily's bedroom, where her daughter slept peacefully under a ceiling of glow-in-the-dark stars. Claire's voice caught in her throat, but she managed to say it anyway. "You don't go alone. I just don't want to hurt her." Margaret took a slow breath and leaned back into her chair. "Then make sure whatever happens next," she said, "you don't go alone." The next morning, Claire stood in front of her bedroom mirror, invitation in hand, hair still damp from the shower, and heart still stuck somewhere between past and present. Her reflection didn't look different, but something inside her was shifting. In the other room, Lily was humming quietly as she colored. Her little voice floated down the hall like a melody from it Claire couldn't quite place. She remembered the first time Lily asked if she had a daddy. It had been over a peanut butter sandwich and a crooked drawing of a stick family. Claire had said, "You have me, sweetheart. That's everything." It had been enough. Mostly. But now, holding that invitation, Claire couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like to let Lily see him, even just once. To let her look into the eyes that matched hers and understand where she came from. Claire wasn't ready for closure. She wasn't ready for apologies or confrontation or anything resembling forgiveness. But maybe she was ready to look the past in the eye and see if it had the courage to look back. The McCall estate looked like something out of a bridal magazine. Manicured, polished, painfully perfect. Everything gleamed. The hedges were trimmed with surgical precision. The reflecting ponds sparkled like glass, and a glass marquee rose near the old oak grove, its skeletal structure already humming with quiet anticipation. Ethan stood on the wide veranda overlooking it all, hands braced against the iron railing, his jaw tight. From the outside, it was everything a Charleston wedding should be. But to Ethan, it felt like watching a stranger's life unfold in slow motion. Bookmark. Behind him, the French doors opened with a quiet thud. Celeste's heels clicked once, then stopped. "There you are," she said, phone in one hand, voice clipped but poised. "The florist needs confirmation on the centerpieces. Also, my father says the Langstons can't sit anywhere near the McKennas. Apparently there's history." Ethan didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the tent. The rows of ivory chairs, the giant cake being wheeled across the lawn on a cart like it was part of a royal procession. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "what any of this is really for?" Celeste blinked. "Excuse me?" "This wedding. he said, still not facing her. Do you think it'll actually make us happy? There was a pause, too short to be reflective, too long to be dismissive. Her voice softened, but only just. Ethan, we're building something important here. Our names, our families. This is a merger, one that works. He finally turned to her. Do you hear yourself? She stepped closer, smile polished to the point of indifference. We're almost there. Just don't overthink it. And with that, she kissed his cheek like a political formality, spun on her heel, and disappeared through the doors. He stood there alone again, feeling the air shift, feeling the weight of something coming. Later that afternoon, in the middle of the estate's quiet buzz and orchestrated chaos, a Navy sedan pulled into the outer circle. No one noticed. Not the staff in pastel polos, not the groundskeepers adjusting the fountain pressure. But Ethan noticed the moment he heard her voice. Whoa, came the small, breathless whisper from the lawn. He turned just as Claire stepped out of the car. The world went quiet. Her dress was simple, cornflower blue. Her dark curls were pinned back loosely. But it wasn't her appearance that stunned him. It was who stood beside her. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, holding tightly to Claire's hand, her eyes wide with awe as she took in the flowers, the string quartet, the glass canopy stretching toward the sky. Ethan stared. She looked like him, exactly like him. The curls, the eyes, the way she furrowed her brow slightly as she scanned the lawn. He could barely breathe. Claire didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply held her daughter's hand a little tighter and started walking toward the marquee. Claire. Ethan's voice cracked as he called out. She turned, and their eyes locked. Time folded. The crowd, the music, the perfection around him dissolved. In its place, the sound of Claire's heels brushing the grass, the delicate patter of the child's footsteps, the unspoken truth thickening the air between them. He walked toward her slowly. Every step felt like moving through water. Hi, the little girl said softly, peeking out from behind her mother's leg. Ethan dropped to a knee, instinctively. Hi, he echoed, voice barely above a whisper. Claire's breath caught. He looked up at her, slowly, as if afraid to ask. Is she? Claire's voice was calm, but tight. She's Lily Grace. That was all she said, but it was enough. The name hung there between them, saturated with implication. Ethan's world tilted on its axis. Before he could speak again, a voice broke through the moment like glass shattering on tile. There you are. Celeste, impeccably dressed, controlled, smiling, until she saw Claire. Then her eyes dipped to the child, and back to Ethan. Who's this? She asked, each syllable heavy with tension disguised as curiosity. Claire's spine straightened. I'm Claire, an old friend of Ethan's. Celeste's smile turned sharper. I've heard of you. Claire didn't blink. Likewise. The silence that followed pulsed. Ethan could feel it in his chest. He cleared his throat. Celeste? This is Lily Grace. Celeste's eyebrows lifted slightly. Lovely name. But her eyes never left Claire. Not even for a second. Claire bent slightly, gently guiding Lily's shoulder. We won't stay long. Just came to wish you well. Ethan's voice cracked. You're leaving? Claire nodded once. I think I've seen enough. Celeste stepped closer, positioning herself just slightly in front of Ethan. That's probably for the best. Claire's jaw tensed, but she said nothing. She simply turned, took Lily's hand, and walked away. Her heels clicked against the stone path, sharp and even. Lily looked back once, confusion in her gaze. Ethan stood frozen, watching them leave, unable to move. The sound of their departure was louder than the quartet, louder than the laughter, louder than the ceremony that was supposed to celebrate his future. It sounded like the past coming back to claim what it never let go of. That night, the estate was silent. The moon hung low over the reflecting pond. Inside his suite, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his phone buzzing beside him. Calls, messages, people wanting to finalize seating charts and cocktail pairings. He didn't answer any of them. He couldn't. Instead, he found himself replaying Lily's voice over and over in his head. Hi. Just that. But it was the way she said it. The softness, the uncanny familiarity, the way her eyes searched his face like it made sense to her before it ever made sense to him. Celeste sat on the opposite side of the room, robe tied perfectly, tablet in her lap. You've been quiet, she said without looking up. My mother wants to confirm the wine list. Ethan didn't respond. Celeste looked up finally. What's wrong with you? He swallowed hard. Then, did you know Claire had a child? Her jaw twitched, almost imperceptibly. She mentioned it years ago. A daughter. I didn't think it was relevant. She has my eyes, Ethan said, voice low. She has my eyes. Celeste stood. So what are you saying? That she's yours? Based on an eye color? I'm saying I think I need to find out. Celeste's eyes narrowed, hardening. Are you serious? A week before our wedding, you want to chase down some old flame and her, maybe child? Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. She's not just some old flame, and that child might be mine. Celeste let out a sharp, hollow laugh. You can't be serious. I am. You're throwing everything away. No, Ethan said. I'm trying to figure out what I already threw away. Celeste stared at him for a long moment. Then she smoothed her robe and turned toward the bathroom. Fine, she said, but don't expect me to smile through it. And then she was gone, heels tapping across the hardwood, leaving Ethan in the kind of silence that doesn't settle. It swallows. The next morning, I stood outside the gate of Harmony Garden with a paper bag in one hand and a knot in my chest. I couldn't untangle. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, and I wondered for a second if I should just turn around. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should have let the silence do what silence does best, keep things buried. But I couldn't. Not after seeing her. Not after hearing that little girl's voice say hi, like it had always been meant for me. The gate creaked as I stepped inside. Children's laughter floated across the beds of marigolds and kale. A row of sunflowers nodded in the breeze, and near the compost bins, with her sleeves rolled up and a red scarf tied around her curls, was Claire. She hadn't seen me yet. She looked exactly like I remembered, except maybe stronger. She turned as I approached. Her eyes widened just for a heartbeat, then narrowed into something unreadable. Ethan, she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. Hey, I said, lifting the paper bag like an awkward peace offering. I wasn't sure if I should come. You're here, she replied, brushing dirt from her gloves. So now what? Can we talk? I asked. Claire studied me for a moment, then nodded toward a wooden shed tucked near the garden's edge. We walked in silence. The inside was warm, paneled in cedar, with bundles of herbs hanging from nails in the rafters. It smelled like rosemary and lemon balm. Like memory. She leaned against a workbench, arms crossed. I stood near the door, unsure where to put my hands. I wasn't expecting to see you again, she said. I wasn't expecting any of this, I replied. She nodded once, eyes steady. So? I drew in a breath. Is she mine? Is she mine? Her jaw tensed, but her voice stayed calm. You really want the truth? I need it. Claire's eyes didn't leave mine. Yes. The word hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Quiet, but devastating. I felt my knees soften. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, she said, not angrily, just tired. You were in Dubai. Your assistant screened my calls. I sent letters. One came back, marked refused. I didn't refuse anything. I figured you made your choice, she said, voice thinning. I figured you wanted the world more than you wanted us. I stepped forward, helpless. I didn't know. Claire, I swear, I had no idea. I know that now, she said, folding her arms tighter, but it doesn't change the years. The ache in my chest cracked wider. Why show up now? Why come to the wedding? I wasn't going to, she admitted, but when I saw that envelope, something in me needed to know, needed to see if you'd look at her and recognize what I've always known. I did, I said, my voice catching. God, Claire, the moment I saw her. She looked down, and I noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly, the same way they used to when she was holding something too fragile. I missed everything, I whispered. Her first word, first steps. I missed her life. Bookmark. Claire's eyes glossed, but she blinked it away. I was the one telling bedtime stories about a dad who lived in the clouds. I was the one showing her how to fix a leaky faucet because there was no one else. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I handed it to her. I drew this last night, I said. I couldn't sleep. She opened it slowly, a pencil sketch, Lily from memory, her curls, her eyes, that slight upward tilt in her smile. Claire's breath hitched. You never stopped drawing, she murmured. Only the important things. Silence pooled around us again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was full. I want to be in her life, I said quietly. I don't know how yet, but I want to try. Claire looked at me, and something in her face softened. But then she straightened, the strength returning like armor. She's not a second chance, Ethan, she said. She's a whole life. You don't get to treat this like it's a painting you can admire when you're in the mood. This is not gallery hours. I'm not walking out again, I said, stepping closer. Not ever. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She looked at me like she was deciding whether to let herself believe me. And then slowly, she handed the sketch back. Then start showing up, she said. She turned and walked past me, the scent of rosemary trailing in her wake. The door creaked open, and the sounds of the garden spilled back in. Children laughing, birds chirping, the world moving forward. This time, I followed. Later that evening, back at the estate, the rehearsal dinner glittered under chandeliers of glass and Spanish moss. Napkins were folded into origami swans, wine flowed like rivers, and laughter bounced between polished smiles. I sat at the far end of the table, untouched plate in front of me, fingers absently toying with a linen napkin. Bookmark. Celeste was holding court at the center, regaling the historical society with some dry joke about preservation ordinances. She hadn't looked at me once. My sister Rachel leaned over. You saw her again, didn't you? I didn't answer. You need to tell Celeste. I know. Before it gets worse. It's already complicated. She's your daughter. The word still startled me. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Claire. She's drawing you again, this time with a boat. I stared at the screen, heart thudding, then read it again and again. Across the table, Rachel watched me, her expression unreadable. But she knew. She always knew. And that night, for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like a man who had everything. I felt like a man who had something to come back for. The next morning, I stood on Claire's porch, with a paper bag in one hand and a cardboard drink tray in the other. I wore a denim jacket over a wrinkled white shirt and probably looked more like a nervous delivery guy than a man trying to step back into a life he once walked away from. The sun was barely up, casting that soft golden light that made everything look like it belonged to a gentler world. I shifted my weight and raised my hand to knock. The door opened before I could. Claire stood there, barefoot, hair pulled into a loose braid, a sleepy wariness in her eyes. "You actually brought breakfast," she said, half surprised, half amused. "I did," I replied, holding up the bag like an offering. "Eggs with cheese, and one blueberry muffin." I wasn't sure about the muffin. Claire's mouth twitched, like she was fighting back a smile. "She'll love the muffin." A small figure peeked from behind her legs. Lily. Her green eyes met mine and lit up like morning itself. "Hi again," she said, more confidently this time. "Hi," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your mom said you like eggs with cheese." She stepped forward, curiosity wide on her face. "Do you want to see my boat drawing?" "I'd love to." We moved to the porch. Claire handed me a mug of coffee without a word and sat across from me, arms folded, watching closely. The kind of watching that wasn't just about observing. It was measuring, weighing, waiting to see if I'd flinch. Lily ran inside and returned a second later with a crayon sketch. A boat with a stick figure waving from the deck and a smaller figure holding a kite on the shore. "This is you," she said, pointing to the figure on the boat. "And this is me with the kite." My throat tightened. "That's really good." Claire's eyes never left me. "We're not talking about custody or titles or anything official," she said, her voice low, firm. "I understand. She's not a puzzle piece, Ethan. You don't get to fit her into your timeline when it's convenient." "I'm not here to fit," I replied, setting down the coffee. "I'm here to build." Claire's brow lifted slightly. "Build what?" I turned to look at Lily, who was now twirling barefoot on the porch, humming a song only she understood. "Something honest," I said. Claire's voice softened, just barely. "You're going to need more than muffins for that." I smiled. "I brought orange juice too." She laughed. One short, unguarded sound, and then caught herself. "But I noticed. I always noticed." "I don't trust easily," she said, the laugh fading from her eyes. "Then I'll keep showing up." She studied me, the silence between us thick but not bitter. Inside, Lily's crayon rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. She bent down to pick it up, then looked up at me, blinking. "Daddy, can we go to the park today?" The word landed like a hammer wrapped in silk. Claire stiffened, her hand pausing on her coffee cup. I froze, but only for a second. Then I knelt beside her. "If it's okay with your mom," I said, voice soft, "I'd love to." A long pause. Claire looked down, her jaw tense, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. And then, carefully, she nodded once. Just once. And that was enough. The park smelled like spring. Cut grass, honeysuckle, the faint metallic scent of the slide baking in the sun. Lily darted ahead of us toward the play structure, her curls bouncing behind her like they had their own rhythm. Claire and I walked side by side along the gravel path, sipping from paper cups, the sound of Lily's giggles ringing through the air. "Is she always this fast?" I asked, watching her scramble up a rope ladder like a jungle explorer. Bookmark. "Only when she's excited," Claire said, "or when she has a new audience." I looked at her then, really looked. Her features were the same, but there was a quiet strength in her now, a grace that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just never slowed down enough to see it. "I still can't believe she's real," I said under my breath. Claire's smile faded. She kept her eyes on Lily. "She's always been real, Ethan. You just weren't looking." I nodded. I deserved that, and probably worse. We sat on a bench under a flowering dogwood. Lily was on the swing set now, pumping her legs and shouting to the wind. "I keep thinking about everything I missed," I said. "Her first birthday, first steps." Claire didn't look at me. "Her first word," I added. "What was it?" She glanced over, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Mama?" "Of course," I said, smiling back. But she said it to a goldfish. I laughed, genuinely, and saw something shift in Claire's shoulders. "When did you know?" I asked. "That you were going to raise her alone?" Her smile vanished. She looked out at the field beyond the playground. "The night I didn't hear back from you," she said, "after I left a message, I sat on the back steps for hours, thought maybe it was the time difference. Thought maybe you'd call." She swallowed hard. "But you didn't." I felt my chest tighten. "I didn't even know you called." "Your assistant did," she said. "I spoke to her once. She said you were unavailable." I closed my eyes, my fists clenched on my knees, then relaxed. "I'm sorry, Claire." She looked at me. "I know." Lily came running back to us, her cheeks pink, her arms covered in chalk and dirt. "Mommy, Daddy, come see what I made." The word hit us both at the same time. Daddy. We didn't correct her. I stood, followed her to the sandbox, and knelt beside her. She pointed proudly to a lumpy mound with sticks for flags and seashells for windows. "It's our house," she declared. "Me, you, and Mommy. We live in it forever." I felt my throat tighten, looked up at Claire. She was watching us, her face unreadable, but her eyes had softened just slightly. That softness didn't last. A voice sliced through the spring air. "Well, this is a charming scene. Celeste." She stood a few feet away, heels too high for gravel, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her head. I stood slowly. "Celeste, what are you doing here?" "I had a board meeting downtown," she said. "Thought I'd take the scenic route." Imagine my surprise. Claire stood too, calm but alert. "You're welcome to join us," she said politely. "There's plenty of sand." Celeste smiled thinly. "I'm good, thanks." Her gaze flicked to Lily, then back to me. "She's adorable." "Her name is Lily Grace," I said, "and she's mine." The words came out clear. Final. Celeste blinked once, but didn't flinch. "I see." A silence stretched between us. "I assume this is what's been keeping you up at night," she said. I told you I needed time. And this is how you spend it, playing house with your old flame and her daughter? Claire stepped forward, voice steady. You don't get to speak about her like that. Celeste's eyes didn't move. You had 7 years. Why now? Because I didn't know, I said. And now that I do, I'm not walking away. Celeste's jaw tightened. So what does this mean? The wedding's off. I don't have all the answers, I said. But I know I owe them more than silence. She stared at me. Something cracked behind her eyes. You're not the man I thought you were. I nodded. You're right. She turned, heels clicking, and walked away without another word. Claire stood frozen. I'm sorry, I said. Don't be sorry for showing up, she replied. Just be sure you're ready to stay. I looked at her, heart thudding. Do you still have the swing sketch? She asked quietly. I blinked. The one from our old porch? The one I drew the night before I left? She nodded. Because I'm wondering if it's time to build another one. And somewhere beneath the weight of everything we'd said, and everything still unsaid, I felt the first pull of something new. Not a second chance. A beginning. The wedding was supposed to be a fairy tale. Rows of ivory chairs gleamed in the sunlight. The old oak tree stood tall at the center of the ceremony, draped in soft white tulle. A string quartet played softly beneath a canopy of Spanish moss. Guests in linen and silk sipped chilled champagne, while murmuring about Charleston's power couple finally tying the knot. Celeste's father was already shaking hands with city councilmen and developers, carving business alliances beneath the guise of flower arrangements. But I wasn't looking at any of that. I was looking at Lily. She stood near the back, small and serious, in a pale blue dress with a marigold pinned to her chest, her curls brushed and shiny, her green eyes scanning the crowd like she was seeing the world for the first time, and trying to decide if she liked it. Claire stood beside her, calm and composed, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder. She wore a soft linen dress that caught the breeze. And though she didn't smile, her presence steadied me like nothing else could. And in that moment, under the oak tree where I was supposed to vow my forever to another woman, I knew I couldn't do it. The music swelled. The guests rose. The bridesmaids stepped down the aisle in rhythm, smiles fixed and graceful. Then Celeste appeared. She looked radiant. Every detail was perfect. Her hair, her makeup, the subtle shimmer on her veil. But when her eyes met mine at the end of the aisle, something behind them flickered. A question, a warning, a demand. I swallowed hard. She reached the altar and stood beside me, her hand brushing my arm. The officiant's voice rang out in practiced tones, welcoming the guests, speaking of commitment and futures and forever. But my mind was spinning. Lily. Claire. The life I could have had. The life I might still build. The officiant asked me to repeat the vows. My throat tightened. I turned to Celeste. I can't do this, I said, my voice quiet but clear. A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. Celeste's face froze, her smile collapsed. What? She whispered. I'm sorry, I said, stepping back. I turned to face the guests, the whole crowd, investors, family, board members, the McCalls, the Rose, and everyone who'd ever seen my life from the outside and thought it was pristine. There's something I need to say. Murmurs sparked through the air like sparks leaping from a fire. I looked toward the back at Lily. That little girl. Her name is Lily Grace, and she's my daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. Even the breeze seemed to still. I looked at Claire, who hadn't moved, but her eyes shimmered like she was caught between shock and heartbreak. "I can't stand up here," I said, "and pretend that I didn't see what I saw. That I don't feel what I feel. I won't build a future on a lie." Celeste's face paled. Her hands dropped to her sides. "I'm sorry," I repeated, quieter now, meant for her alone. "But I have to be the man I should have been 7 years ago." From the crowd, Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm and unwavering. "This is the man we know. The man who owns his mistakes, the one who's finally trying to get it right." I turned back to Claire. And to Lily. "I don't want to be a ghost in her life," I said. "I want to be her father. I want to be more than someone who shows up too late." Lily took a small step forward, then another. I dropped to my knees as she crossed the aisle, and when she wrapped her arms around my neck, the weight of every year I had missed crushed me. I held her tighter than I'd ever held anything. And the applause came, quiet at first, then growing. Not polite, not performative, real. As if even the strangers who had come to watch a wedding realized they'd just witnessed something that mattered more. Celeste stood still, unmoving. I looked at her one last time. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the stone path as the veil fluttered in her wake like a ghost. The guests parted for her in silence. The sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, bathing us in warmth, and beneath that tree, once meant to crown someone else's happily ever after, I stood with my daughter in my arms and Claire just a breath away. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Because somehow, without ribbons or cake or contracts, something real had begun. The next morning, Charleston buzzed with headlines. Roe wedding halted at the altar. Secret daughter changes everything, from CEO to father overnight. Most of it was speculation and spin, the kind of gossip that gets passed around cafes and email chains. But I didn't care. I sat alone in the sunroom of my condo, coffee cooling beside me, the garden swing I'd built with Claire swaying gently outside the window. I didn't care about the firm. I didn't care about the press. I didn't care about how many people thought I'd ruined everything. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't ruined anything. I'd saved something. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Claire standing there with Lily in a brown paper bag. "I thought you might need these," she said. Inside were 2 jars of preserves, a loaf of still warm bread, and a small note in Lily's handwriting that said, "For toast and together." I smiled. "Come in." We ate in the kitchen, just the 3 of us. Lily swung her legs under the table and spread jam across her bread with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "I want to help," she said suddenly. "At the garden. With Mommy. With you." Claire glanced at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. A hope she hadn't let herself believe in yet. I reached across the table and gently covered her hand with mine. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, after Lily was tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed dolphin, Claire and I sat on the porch. The swing creaked gently in the breeze, the air filled with the smell of lemon balm and fresh-cut grass. "You did a brave thing," she said. "So did you." She looked at me, searching. "And now what?" I took a breath. "Now we build something. Together." She didn't answer right away, just leaned her head against my shoulder as the sky faded to dusk. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. I felt like I'd arrived. The weeks that followed moved both fast and slow, like a river with an unpredictable current. One day, you're standing beneath an oak tree with your daughter in your arms, declaring a truth to the world. The next, you're learning how she takes her eggs, soft scrambled with too much cheese, and that she insists her stuffed dolphin gets its own chair at breakfast. Every morning, I showed up. Sometimes with flowers, sometimes with cartoons doodled on the back of napkins, sometimes just with a quiet promise I didn't say out loud but carried in the way I stood in her doorway with a paper bag full of warm muffins. Lily would light up every time, and Claire, well, she watched. Not cold, not warm, just watchful. Like someone who had seen storms pass before and knew not to celebrate the first drop of sun too quickly. One Saturday, I arrived with a toolbox and a long flat package under my arm. Bookmark. Claire opened the door, brow arched. "You're early." I shrugged. Sheepish? Got impatient? "What's in the package?" I untied the twine and peeled back the brown paper. Cedar planks. Sanded smooth. 2 thick coils of rope. Bolts. A spirit level? "A swing?" I said. "Or the pieces of one?" Her breath caught. "I figured," I went on, "if we're talking about building something, maybe we start here." She didn't say anything for a while. Just looked at the wood, then at the spot beneath the old oak tree where the grass had worn thin. "I used to sit there when I was pregnant," she said quietly. "Didn't have the energy to do much else. I should have been here." "Yes," she said, not harsh, not angry. Just, yes. "But you're here now." We carried the wood to the tree. She held the planks while I tied the knots, checked the leveling, anchored the bolts into the thick old branch. Lily peeked out the window every 5 minutes, squealing with delight when she saw the frame taking shape. When it was done, I tested it with my weight. It creaked but held. "Bookmark." "Sturdy," I said. Claire smirked. "Like you remembered how to build something." "Some things," I said, brushing my palms together, "you don't forget." The swing hung motionless for a moment, just glowing in the soft afternoon light. Then the front door flew open, and Lily burst out barefoot, arms wide, curls flying. "Is it ready? Can I try it?" I stepped back, smiling. "All yours, sweetheart." She climbed on, and we watched her soar, forward, back, higher and higher. Her laughter cut through the quiet like a bell, like music. Claire looked over at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the girl I once loved, the one I used to sketch in quiet corners, the one who smelled like rosemary and fresh soil. "She loves it," like me said. "I want to give her more than a swing," I said, my voice low. She turned, cautious. "Do you really understand what that means?" "I think I'm starting to." "It's not just weekend visits and ice cream runs," she said. "It's dentist appointments. It's tantrums in the middle of the grocery store. It's showing up when it's hard. It's saying no when she wants yes." I nodded. "Then I'll learn. I'll fail. And I'll keep showing up anyway." She didn't answer right away. Her face shifted slightly, something tender flickering under the edges of her hesitation. Later that night, after Lily had passed out in a tangle of books and blankets, we sat on the porch steps with mugs of chamomile tea. The swing moved gently in the breeze, ropes whispering to the stars. "Do you think we could ever be us again?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked, "Why did you really leave, Ethan?" "Back then." I looked down into my tea, then out into the quiet. I told myself it was ambition. I said that I needed to chase something bigger, that I didn't want to end up ordinary. And now? I swallowed the lump in my throat. Now I'd trade every skyline I ever designed for just one more year with you and her. Her fingers curled slightly around the mug. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You broke my heart. I know. I know. It wasn't just the leaving, she continued. It was the disappearing. No letters. No calls. Nothing. You vanished. I said, disappearing would hurt less than admitting I was afraid. She blinked fast, then looked out toward the swing. I don't know what this is, Ethan. I don't know if it's just nostalgia or something real. But I do know one thing. Lily comes first. Always. That's why I'm here. I said. We sat there in the hush of everything unsaid. No plans, no guarantees. Just quiet hope pulsing between us like a fragile thread. The next morning, I cooked French toast while Lily arranged her stuffed animals around the breakfast table like they were VIP guests. Claire poured juice into mismatched cups, smiling slightly when I fumbled with the spatula. You'll want to master both buildings and breakfast, she teased. That's the plan, I said, cheeks warm. Daddy made toast. Real toast, Lily announced to her plush audience. Claire looked over at me, startled. The word still hit me like a firework in the chest. I hadn't earned it yet, but I didn't want to correct her, not when her smile was that big. You mean Grandma's recipe, Lily said, pointing. I chuckled. I mean your mom's recipe, but yes, Grandma taught it to me. Claire arched a brow. Taught is a generous word. You stole it. Borrowed without permission. Better. Better. After breakfast, we took Lily to the farmer's market. It was in full swing. Live music, flower carts, handmade soaps, children running barefoot between stalls. Claire walked beside me, still guarded, still weighing everything. People stared. They saw what they thought was a story, but they didn't know it was just a beginning. At the flower booth, Lily asked the vendor, "What color does love smell like?" The woman smiled and handed her a purple marigold. This one. For happy love. I looked at Claire. She looked away. That afternoon, back at the house, Lily fell asleep on the couch, clutching her flower like a secret. Claire and I stood on the porch, watching the swing sway empty in the wind. She trusts you, she said. Easily, but she remembers deeply. I don't want to break that. You better not. She looked at me for a long time, then turned toward the garden. I'm going to check the basil. Can you help her with the watering cans? I nodded, gladly. The sun dipped low, the wind picked up. And somewhere between the tomatoes and the thyme, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I was home. The morning sun poured over the garden like gold leaf, soft and slow, catching on dew-covered leaves and the quiet shimmer of new blossoms. Lily sat at the old oak table, legs swinging, tongue poked out as she colored a sailboat with crayons worn down to nubs. I sat beside her, watching her concentrate, every stroke so serious, so full of purpose. Her tiny hand gripped mine to steady the mast she was drawing. You're getting really good at this, I said. I'm going to draw us on the boat next, she replied without looking up. Mommy said we might go someday. I swallowed the warmth rising in my chest. I can't wait for that day. Behind us, Claire leaned against the doorway, watching with an expression I'd come to recognize, half tenderness, half fear. Her heart wanted to believe, but her history wouldn't let her, not yet. I could see the tension in her fingers as they curled around the edge of the frame. Looks like an artist and her muse, she said gently, stepping forward with a cup of tea. I glanced up and smiled, but it faltered the moment my phone buzzed on the table. Claire caught it too. I glanced at the screen. Caroline. I hesitated, then answered, "Hey." Caroline's voice was low and direct. "Celeste wants to meet. Tonight." I closed my eyes. "Why?" She didn't say. "But she's not doing well, Ethan. She deserves to talk this through." I ended the call and turned to Claire, who was already watching. "Everything okay?" she asked. I hesitated. "She wants to meet." Claire's eyes didn't waver. "Do you want to?" "I think I need to," I said, "for closure, for truth." She set her cup down and stepped closer, touching my hand lightly. "Just be careful. This isn't just about you anymore." That night, the McCall estate felt like a museum after hours. Too quiet, too pristine. I stepped through the doors I had once expected to walk through as a groom, and found Celeste sitting in the drawing room, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. "You came," she said. "I owed you that," I replied, sitting across from her. She studied me for a long time before speaking. "You've changed the game, Ethan. Resigning from the firm, spending time with her." "I'm trying to do what's right," I said. She scoffed softly. "Is that what this is? Right? Throwing away everything we built?" "What we built," I said calmly, "was a structure that looked good on the outside, but it wasn't made to last." She stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "So I was just a placeholder?" "No," I said. "You were part of a version of me that I wanted to believe in, but I was lying to myself. And you didn't deserve that." Her eyes glimmered with tears she refused to let fall. "You broke a promise. You broke a promise." "I know," I said. "But I won't keep making the wrong ones just to avoid admitting I made a mistake." She wrapped her arms around herself and nodded. "Then prove it." And just like that, the conversation ended, not with rage or recrimination, but with quiet surrender. When I got back to Claire's, the porch light was still on. She met me at the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. "How did it go?" she asked. "Harder than I thought," I said. "But honest." Claire nodded slowly, her expression softening just a fraction. "There's still a long way to go," I added. She reached for my hand. "We'll walk it together." The next day, I found myself at the community garden with Claire and Lily, surrounded by raised beds and volunteers. Lily skipped through the rows, pointing out sunflowers and shouting greetings to every bug she saw. Claire handed me a watering can and grinned. "You're on watering duty today." "Yes, ma'am," I said, tipping the can as carefully as I could. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a local community event. A new bridge was being rebuilt between two neighborhoods that had long been separated by more than just a stream. As I stood in front of the crowd with Claire and Lily watching from beneath an oak tree, I cleared my throat. "This bridge," I said, "isn't just a structure. It's a choice. A choice to connect, to reach across what's been broken, and to say, this matters." And the strongest structures aren't always the ones with the best materials. They're the ones built with honesty, trust, and love. I saw Claire's hand slide into Lily's. Later that night, Lily curled into my side on the couch, thumb tucked beneath her chin, whispering, "Can we build a treehouse next?" Claire laughed softly from the kitchen. "Start small, sweetheart." But I looked at both of them and said, "We can build anything." Weeks passed. The days weren't always easy. Some mornings Lily woke up fussy, other nights Claire and I sat in silence because words didn't come easily. But every moment was real. Unpolished. Ours. One evening, Claire and I sat on the porch while Lily napped inside. "You're rebuilding your whole life," she said. "I have to," I answered. "The foundation I laid before was hollow." "You'll need a job," she said. I smiled. I was hoping Harmony Garden had an opening. We pay in tomatoes and unsolicited advice. Perfect. She looked at me, eyes full of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "I never really stopped," she said quietly. "Loving me?" I asked. "Hoping." We sat there until the stars came out, the swing creaking softly behind us. No vows, no titles, just breath and time and the faint, growing hum of something new taking root. And in that stillness, I finally understood. Love wasn't a ceremony or a statement. It was a choice made every day. In breakfast eggs, in watering cans, in showing up after all the applause had faded. We didn't need a wedding. We had something better. A family. Thank you, truly, for staying with me until the very end of this story. If there's one thing this journey reminds us, it's that it's never too late to come home. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but when it does, it's up to us to choose courage over comfort, truth over pride, and love over fear. Sometimes, healing means admitting you were wrong and choosing to show up anyway, even if you arrive a little late. This wasn't just a story about a lost love or a child waiting to be claimed. It was a story about redemption, responsibility, and the quiet, steady work of rebuilding what matters most. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know where our community is growing. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if this story moved you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more powerful, heartfelt stories coming your way. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that love, at its core, is about showing up, again and again. Hit that bell? We'll be here, waiting for you.